How did a medical emergency expose your best friend's darkest secret? I was out shopping for my boyfriend's birthday when my phone lit up with an emergency medical alert. My brother's heart rate was spiking rapidly, and his oxygen levels had started dropping. This was life-threatening, and I wasn't there to help him. I called my best friend Tessa immediately. She'd volunteered to watch Declan at home while I went shopping. Tessa! Declan's vitals are going crazy. He's having a seizure. Call 911 right now. Tessa's voice sounded panicked. Oh my god, what? Okay, what do I do? Call an ambulance. Call them now. His oxygen is dropping. I was already running to my car in the parking lot. People were staring at me, but I didn't care. I'm calling right now. I'm calling, Tessa said. I could hear her breathing hard. I threw my shopping bags in the back seat and started the car. I checked the app again. Declan's oxygen was at 89%. His heart rate was 155. Both numbers were bad. If they got worse, he could have permanent brain damage or die. I pulled out of the parking lot and started speeding toward the hospital to meet them. My phone showed Declan's location on the map. He was still at home. I called Tessa again. Did you call? Are they coming? I asked Tessa. She sounded flustered and out of breath. Yes! They're coming. They said 4 minutes. Then my phone buzzed. Tessa sent me a screenshot. It showed a 911 call screen that said, Ambulance dispatched, ETA 4 minutes, St. Mary's Hospital. I felt a tiny bit of relief. Help was coming, but I kept checking the app. Declan's oxygen was at 87 now. 8 minutes went by. I was halfway to the hospital. I checked Declan's location again. He was still at home. They should have picked him up by now. I called Tessa again. Where's the ambulance? They should be there. I don't know, Tessa said. Maybe traffic? I can hear the sirens getting closer. Okay, I'm almost at the hospital. Tell them to hurry. Then I heard something weird. Music playing in the background, and someone's voice laughing. Tessa, is someone there with you? Who is that? What? No, that's just the TV. I'm waiting for the ambulance. Something felt wrong, but I didn't know what. 5 more minutes passed. I pulled into the hospital parking lot. I checked Declan's location on my phone. Still home. My stomach dropped. The ambulance should have taken him by now. It had been 13 minutes since Tessa called 911. I checked the app. Declan's oxygen was at 84. His heart rate was 165. He was in critical danger. I called Tessa. It rang twice and went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the phone. I called the hospital. Did an ambulance just pick up a seizure patient from my address? The woman on the phone clicked her keyboard. No, ma'am. We haven't sent any ambulances to that address today. My blood went cold. Tessa lied. But why lie about this? I screamed and threw my car into drive. I had to get home. I tried calling Tessa again and again. No answer. The traffic was terrible. It took me 15 minutes just to get halfway home. I kept checking the app. Declan's vitals were getting worse and worse. He'd been seizing for 30 minutes now. I tried calling my boyfriend for help. Maybe he could check on Declan. Hey babe, something's wrong at the house. Can you go check on Declan? I said, panicked. My boyfriend sounded annoyed. I'm actually in a meeting right now. Can this wait? Then I heard it. Music. The same playlist that was playing in the background when I called Tessa. Either it was a coincidence, or he was at my house with Tessa, while my brother was dying. I hung up and drove faster. 40 minutes had passed since the first alert. I screeched into my driveway and ran inside like a maniac, praying it wasn't too late. I found Declan on the living room couch, facing away from me. His body was jerking and I could see foam coming out of his mouth even from behind him. He was still actively seizing. His medical monitor was beeping like crazy. He was minutes away from death. I dropped to my knees and called 911. My brother is having a seizure. Send an ambulance to this address now. As the operator spoke, I could hear sounds from upstairs. Moaning, the bed creaking. Tessa was upstairs doing it with someone while my brother was dying on the couch downstairs. I stayed with Declan the whole time. 2 minutes later, I heard Tessa coming downstairs, laughing like something was funny. It was obvious she hadn't noticed me running in or calling 911. She walked in through the living room doors in a robe. We made direct eye contact, and I saw a man's leg peering out from behind the door. I recognized the tattoo immediately. It was my boyfriend. Tessa and my boyfriend were having an affair and couldn't stop fondling each other long enough to make a 2-minute call to save my brother's life. I was soothing my brother while whisper screaming at her. Show me the 911 call, I said. You said you called 911. Where is it? Tessa started crying suddenly. I'll explain. I'm sure you will, I responded, grabbing my phone to make another 911 call, but not to the hospital. And not to the police either. Tessa's face went wide. The sirens were already getting louder outside. The real ambulance I'd called screaming down my street. Tessa's mouth opened and closed like she wanted to say something but couldn't find words. Jasper stepped fully into view, pulling on his shirt with shaking hands. The paramedics burst through my front door 3 seconds later, a team of 4 with equipment bags and a stretcher. I pointed at Declan without looking away from Tessa. The lead paramedic, a woman with short gray hair, dropped to her knees beside my brother and started checking his vitals immediately. Her partner got the oxygen mask on Declan's face while the other 2 prepared the stretcher. I stayed right next to Declan, holding his hand while they worked, my body positioned so I didn't have to see Tessa or Jasper standing frozen by the stairs. The gray-haired paramedic looked at her watch and then at me. She asked how long he'd been seizing. I told her 43 minutes now, maybe longer. Her face went tight and she called out numbers to her team that I didn't understand. They moved fast, getting Declan onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency. One of them started an IV line in his arm. Another one radioed the hospital with information about his condition. The gray-haired paramedic told me they needed to get him to St. Mary's immediately. That 40 minutes was dangerously long for a seizure. I nodded and grabbed my purse from where I'd dropped it. Tessa took a step forward. I held up one hand without looking at her, my eyes on Declan's pale face. The paramedics wheeled him toward the door. I followed right behind them, not saying a word to either Tessa or Jasper. Outside, they loaded Declan into the ambulance. I climbed in after him before anyone could tell me not to. The paramedic working on Declan's IV looked at me and nodded like she understood. Through the back windows, I could see Tessa running out of the house, still in that robe. She was trying to get to the ambulance. I looked right at her through the glass and mouthed one word. Don't. The ambulance doors slammed shut and we pulled away with sirens blaring. Inside, the paramedics were giving Declan medication through his IV to stop the seizure. I sat on the bench seat watching my brother's face, watching the monitors beeping around him. His body was still jerking, but less than before. The medication was working. The gray-haired paramedic told me his name was on his medical alert bracelet, asked if I was family. I said I was his sister and primary caregiver. She asked what happened, why the delay. I told her someone was supposed to call 911 40 minutes ago but didn't. She looked at me for a long second, and then went back to monitoring Declan's vitals. The ride took 7 minutes. They rushed him through the emergency department doors while I followed, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold my purse. A nurse stopped me at the intake desk while they took Declan back. She handed me a clipboard with paperwork and asked me to fill out what I could. I sat in a plastic chair and stared at the forms. My hands were shaking too much to write clearly. The nurse came back a minute later with a cup of water. She sat down next to me and asked gently what happened. I started explaining about the medical alert, the seizure, calling my friend who was supposed to be watching him. When I got to the part about the 40-minute delay and why it happened, my voice cracked. The nurse's expression changed from sympathy to something harder. She asked if I was saying someone deliberately didn't call for help. I nodded and told her they faked a 911 call instead. She stood up and said she needed to make a note of that for the doctor. 20 minutes later, a doctor in blue scrubs came out and introduced himself as Dr. Gideon Garza. He was the neurologist on call. He told me they'd given Declan medication to stop the seizure and it had worked, but they needed to run a full workup. Brain scans to check for damage from the prolonged seizure. Blood tests to check his medication levels. He explained that 40 minutes was extremely dangerous for a seizure. We wouldn't know the full extent of potential complications for at least 24 to 48 hours. I asked what kind of complications. Dr. Garza listed them carefully. Brain injury, cognitive effects, increased seizure frequency, memory problems. I sat there taking it in while he talked. He said they were moving Declan to the ICU for close monitoring. I could see him once they got him settled. I thanked him and he walked back through the double doors. I sat in the waiting room feeling numb and exhausted. My phone started buzzing in my purse. I pulled it out and saw texts from Tessa filling my screen. I'm so sorry. Please let me explain. It's not what you think. I didn't mean for this to happen. Please talk to me. I deleted each one without reading past the first few words. More texts kept coming. I blocked her number completely. My phone rang 3 times in a row. Jasper calling. I blocked him too. The silence felt good. I sat there staring at the wall, feeling nothing but cold contempt for both of them. An hour passed. I texted my coworker Fiona that I wouldn't be at work tomorrow. Family emergency. She texted back immediately asking if I was okay, if I needed anything. I told her I was at St. Mary's Hospital. She said she was coming. I told her she didn't have to. She said she was already getting in her car. Fiona showed up 40 minutes later carrying a bag from the convenience store. She'd brought me coffee and a change of clothes, a clean shirt and pants. She sat down next to me in the waiting room without asking questions. Just sat there with me while we waited for news about Declan. Her quiet presence was the first moment of genuine support I'd felt since this nightmare started. I almost started crying from the relief of having someone actually help instead of making things worse. Fiona squeezed my hand and told me it would be okay. I nodded even though I didn't believe it. 2 hours after we'd arrived, the ER doctor came out to find me. She was a woman in her 50s with tired eyes. She told me Declan was stable but sedated. They were keeping him in ICU for close monitoring. The seizure had stopped with medication, but the prolonged duration meant there was risk of brain injury, cognitive effects, future seizure complications. She said I could see him now if I wanted. I stood up immediately. Fiona said she'd wait here. The doctor led me through the double doors and down a hallway to the ICU. Declan's room was full of beeping machines and monitors. He looked small and fragile in the hospital bed, tubes and wires everywhere. I sat in the chair next to his bed and took his hand carefully. The full weight of what almost happened crashed over me all at once. If I'd been 5 minutes later getting home, if the seizure had lasted any longer, I could have lost him. Because 2 selfish people couldn't stop screwing each other long enough to make a phone call. The rage that filled me was cold and focused, nothing like the panic from earlier. This was calculated fury that demanded consequences. A woman in professional clothes knocked on the doorframe. She introduced herself as a hospital social worker and asked if she could talk to me for a minute. I nodded. She came in and sat in the other chair. She said the nurse had mentioned some concerning circumstances around the delayed emergency response. She suggested gently that I might want to file a police report. She explained that deliberately faking a 911 call while someone was dying could constitute criminal negligence or even attempted manslaughter depending on the circumstances. I told her I was considering my options. She gave me her card and said to call if I needed anything. After she left, I sat with Declan for another hour before Fiona knocked softly. She said it was almost midnight, asked if I wanted to go home and grab some clothes and things for Declan. I did need his medications and some clean clothes. I made Fiona wait in the car because I couldn't handle anyone else being in that house right now. Inside, the living room still showed signs of the chaos. Declan's medical monitor was on the couch where the paramedics had left it. My purse was on the floor where I'd dropped it the first time. I went upstairs to Declan's room and packed quickly, grabbing his medications from the bathroom, clean clothes from his dresser. I refused to look at the stairs or think about what had happened in my bedroom. I got out of there as fast as I could and locked the door behind me. I got back to the hospital around 1 in the morning and went straight to Declan's ICU room. Fiona said goodnight and told me to text if I needed anything. The reclining chair next to his bed was stiff and uncomfortable. I pulled the thin blanket over myself and tried to close my eyes. Every time I started to drift off, I saw Tessa's face when she walked into that living room, the fake concern in her voice on the phone, the way she laughed coming down those stairs. My eyes snapped open again. The machines around Declan beeped steadily. I checked my phone. 1:15. I tried again to sleep. This time I saw Jasper's tattoo behind that door. Heard the bed creaking upstairs while my brother was dying below. My whole body tensed up. I sat up in the chair and rubbed my face. A nurse came in to check Declan's vitals around 2. She noticed me sitting there awake and asked if I was okay. I told her I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. She adjusted Declan's IV and then looked at me. She said she'd been a nurse for 15 years and seen a lot of terrible things. But what happened to my brother made her sick. The way she said it, with real anger in her voice, made something loosen in my chest. Someone else understood how bad this was. Someone else thought I had every right to be furious. She brought me an extra blanket before she left. I managed to sleep for maybe 2 hours total that night. Morning came with bright fluorescent lights and the sound of the day shift nurses starting their rounds. Dr. Agarza showed up around 7 to run more tests on Declan. He checked Declan's eyes with a light and asked him to follow his finger. The sedation was wearing off now. Declan's eyes opened slowly and he looked around the room confused. He tried to sit up, but Dr. Agarza told him to stay still. Declan saw me in the chair and his face relaxed a little. Dr. Agarza explained they needed to check his brain function and make sure everything was working right after the seizure. Declan asked what happened. His voice was rough and quiet. I moved my chair closer to the bed and took his hand. I told him he had a really bad seizure that lasted a long time. He asked how long. I said 40 minutes. His eyes went wide. He asked where Tessa was, if she called the ambulance. My jaw clenched. I told him Tessa didn't call anyone. She lied about calling. He stared at me, trying to understand. I explained that I had to drive home and call 911 myself because she never actually made the call. Declan's face went completely white. He asked where she was now. I told him she wasn't welcome anywhere near us ever again. He nodded slowly and closed his eyes. Dr. Agarza finished his tests and said he'd have results later that day. Around 10 that morning, a man in his 30s showed up asking the nurse where to find me. She pointed him toward the waiting area where I was getting coffee. He walked over and introduced himself as Neil Chapman. The name took me a second to place. Tessa's older brother. I immediately started looking for security. Neil held up his hands and said he just wanted to talk for a minute. He said he had no idea what happened until this morning when his parents called him. I told him I didn't want to talk to anyone from Tessa's family. Neil said he understood, but he needed to hear what actually happened because Tessa was only telling everyone her version. Something in his face looked genuine. I decided to give him 5 minutes. I told him the whole timeline. The emergency alert at the store. Calling Tessa, who said she'd call 911. The fake screenshot she sent me. Waiting at the hospital for an ambulance that never came. Driving home to find Declan still seizing after 40 minutes. Finding Tessa and Jasper upstairs together while my brother was dying downstairs. Neil's face changed as I talked. He looked sick. He said he'd always known his sister was selfish and made bad choices, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He asked if there was anything he could do to help. I looked at Neil for a long moment. I told him the only thing that would help is if Tessa faces real consequences for what she did. Not just people being mad at her. Real legal consequences. Neil nodded slowly. He said he understood and he wouldn't try to protect her from this. Then he pulled out his phone and typed something. He showed me his screen where he'd added his contact information. He said if I needed a witness to her character or past behavior, he'd be willing to talk to police or lawyers. That surprised me. Her own brother thought she deserved whatever was coming. He said Tessa had been getting away with selfish behavior their whole lives because their parents always made excuses for her. Maybe this time she'd actually have to face what she'd done. After Neil left, I added his number to my phone under Neil, Tessa's brother, witness. I filed it away as something I might need later. Having someone from her own family willing to testify against her felt like a small win. That afternoon, a woman in professional clothes showed up and asked to speak with me. She introduced herself as Alicia Takahashi and said my mom had given her my number years ago. I remembered her vaguely from some legal stuff my mom had dealt with. Alicia said she'd gotten my voicemail about needing a family attorney. We found an empty consultation room and I explained the entire situation from the beginning. Alicia took notes on a yellow legal pad while I talked. Her expression got more and more serious as I described the fake 911 call, the 40-minute delay, finding them together upstairs. When I finished, she put down her pen and looked at me directly. She said this could be criminal negligence at minimum, possibly more serious charges depending on how the DA saw it. The fake 911 call was its own separate crime. She said I should definitely file a police report to create an official record of everything. I told her I planned to. Alicia said she'd start preparing a civil case as well for medical costs and damages. She asked if I had any evidence. I showed her the screenshots from my medical alert app, the fake 911 image Tessa had sent me, my call logs showing when I tried to reach her. Alicia photographed everything with her phone. She said this was solid evidence and we had a strong case. The next morning, Dr. Garza came in with test results from Declan's second day of exams. He sat down in the chair next to the bed and pulled out some papers with brain scan images. He pointed to areas that showed slightly unusual activity patterns. He explained that Declan's brain was showing some concerning results. The prolonged seizure had caused damage that might lead to long-term effects. Declan might have memory problems, more frequent seizures, or trouble with thinking and processing information. It was too early to know exactly how bad it would be. They'd need to monitor him for weeks or months to understand the full extent. I sat there listening to Dr. Garza list all these possible problems. Each one felt like another item to add to the list of things Tessa and Jasper would answer for. My resolve got harder and colder. They didn't just risk killing him. They actually caused permanent damage that would affect the rest of his life. Dr. Garza said they'd start Declan on stronger medications and schedule regular follow-up appointments. I asked if this would have happened if the seizure had been stopped sooner. Dr. Garza hesitated and then said probably not. Most of this damage was directly related to how long the seizure lasted. Later that day, a detective from the police department showed up to take my report. She was a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and a calm way of speaking. She sat across from me in the consultation room and pulled out a recording device. She asked if I minded being recorded, and I said no. Then she told me to start from the beginning and tell her everything. I went through the whole timeline again without her interrupting once. When I finished, she started asking specific questions. What time did I get the first alert? What time did I call Tessa? What time did Tessa send the fake screenshot? What time did I arrive home? How long had Declan been seizing when the real paramedics arrived? I answered every question and showed her all my evidence. The medical alert app screenshots showing the timeline. My call logs proving when I tried to reach Tessa. The hospital records documenting that Declan had been seizing for over 40 minutes. The detective looked through everything carefully. She said this was definitely worth investigating and asked if I was willing to provide a formal statement. I told her absolutely. She said she'd be in touch and would probably need to interview Declan once he was feeling better. 2 days later, I was in the hospital cafeteria getting lunch when Tessa appeared out of nowhere. I don't know how she got past security. She walked right up to my table and started talking. She said my name and that she needed to explain. I cut her off immediately. I told her the only conversation we were having was through lawyers and police. If she came near me or Declan again, I'd file for a restraining order. Tessa's face crumpled and she started crying. She said I was being unreasonable, that she made a mistake, that she panicked. I stood up and picked up my tray. I told her she didn't panic. She deliberately sent me a fake screenshot and then went upstairs to sleep with my boyfriend while my brother was dying. Then I walked away while she was still talking. I felt absolutely nothing watching her cry. No sympathy, no guilt, just disgust that she thought tears would fix what she'd done. That same evening, I checked my email and found a long message from Jasper. The subject line said, "Please read this." I almost deleted it without opening, but decided I should see what he had to say. The email was 3 paragraphs of excuses. He claimed they panicked when Declan started seizing, that they made a mistake in the moment, that they never meant for anyone to get hurt, that he hoped I could understand they were just scared and didn't know what to do. I read it twice. Then I forwarded the entire email to both Alicia and the detective without writing any response to Jasper. His words were just evidence that he knew what they'd done was wrong. Alicia had told me that trying to explain and minimize their actions showed consciousness of guilt. The fact that Jasper was already making excuses and asking for understanding told me everything about his character. He wasn't actually sorry. He just didn't want to face consequences. Around 7 that night, Fiona showed up with takeout containers from the Thai place near our office. She'd brought pad Thai and spring rolls. We sat in Declan's room eating while he slept. Fiona asked me directly what I was planning to do about Tessa and Jasper. I told her honestly that I was still deciding between just legal action or something more personal. Fiona didn't look shocked or try to talk me out of anything. She just nodded and said whatever I chose, she had my back if I needed help. Having someone in my corner who wasn't trying to push forgiveness or mercy felt incredibly good. Most people would have told me to let it go or move on, or not let anger consume me. Fiona understood that some things don't deserve forgiveness. Some betrayals are permanent. She finished her food and told me she'd cover for me at work as long as I needed. Then she hugged me and left. I sat there in the quiet hospital room feeling grateful that at least one person in my life actually showed up when it mattered. The next morning, a nurse came in and told me they were moving Declan to a regular room on the 3rd floor. Good news, she said, because it meant he was stable enough to leave intensive care. I helped gather his things while the transport team got him ready, and we rode the elevator up together. The new room had a window and felt less like a medical emergency zone, which should have been comforting. But when the nurses finished setting up his monitors and left us alone, Declan grabbed my hand and wouldn't let go. He asked me to promise I wouldn't leave him with anyone else ever again. Just me taking care of him from now on. No one else could be trusted. I heard the fear in his voice and realized Tessa's betrayal had broken something in him that would take a long time to fix. He kept asking if I was sure no one else would watch him, if I was absolutely certain I'd be there if something happened. I promised him over and over, but I could see the trauma in his eyes every time he asked. Around noon, Dr. Garza came in with a tablet and pulled up a chair next to the bed. He went through Declan's discharge plan in detail, explaining that his seizure risk was now higher than before the incident. The 40-minute seizure had changed things permanently. Declan would need more frequent monitoring, stronger medications, and follow-up appointments every 2 weeks instead of monthly. Dr. De Garza listed the new prescriptions and their costs, the additional testing required, the specialist consultations we'd need to schedule. I did the math in my head while he talked. The new medications alone would cost hundreds more per month. The extra appointments meant more copays and time off work. The additional monitoring equipment we'd need at home wasn't cheap either. Every number added up to thousands of dollars we wouldn't be spending if Tessa had just made one phone call. I grabbed my phone and started making notes of every single cost Dr. Garza mentioned. Alicia would need these figures for the civil lawsuit she was already preparing. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard the detective's voice. She told me she'd interviewed Tessa and Jasper separately yesterday, and their stories didn't match up in several key places. Tessa claimed she thought she'd actually called 911, that she panicked and got confused about whether she'd really done it. Jasper insisted Tessa told him the ambulance was coming, so he assumed everything was handled. Each of them was trying to shift the blame to the other person. The detective said their willingness to throw each other under the bus was helping build a stronger case for criminal charges. I should have felt satisfied hearing this, but mostly I just felt disgusted. They'd been so wrapped up in each other that my brother almost died, and now they couldn't even take responsibility without blaming their partner in negligence. The detective told me she'd be forwarding her report to the district attorney's office soon, and I thanked her for the update. That night, after Declan finally fell asleep around 10, I pulled out my laptop and started researching. I looked up criminal negligence laws in our state, reading through case summaries and legal definitions. I learned that what Tessa and Jasper did could potentially be charged as reckless endangerment, which carried jail time. The fake 911 call was its own separate crime called filing a false police report. I moved on to civil liability next, reading about personal injury lawsuits and damages. They could be held responsible for all of Declan's medical costs, both current and future, plus emotional distress damages, plus punitive damages if the jury thought their actions were especially bad. The numbers could easily reach 6 figures. I made detailed notes about everything I learned, organizing the information into categories for criminal versus civil consequences. Having multiple paths to make them pay made me feel less helpless, more in control of what happened next. I wasn't just a victim of their betrayal anymore. I was someone taking action to ensure they faced every possible consequence. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from Neil. He said Tessa had been staying at his place and was falling apart over what happened. He asked if there was any chance I'd be willing to hear her out, to let her explain and apologize. I stared at the message for a few seconds, then typed one word back: number. His response came immediately saying he understood and he was sorry for asking. At least someone in her family had basic sense about boundaries and consequences. I appreciated that Neil wasn't trying to pressure me or defend his sister's actions. 2 days later, Alicia called to tell me she'd filed the civil lawsuit against both Tessa and Jasper. The papers detailed everything they'd done and exactly what it had cost us. She'd had them served that morning at their homes. Alicia said their reactions to being served would tell us a lot about how seriously they were taking this situation. If they lawyered up immediately, they understood the trouble they were in. If they tried to handle it themselves or ignored it, they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. I told her I hoped they underestimated the situation, because watching them realize they were in real trouble would be deeply satisfying. Declan was finally discharged on the 5th day, with a thick stack of instructions and prescriptions. The pharmacy bill alone was over $300 even with our insurance. I loaded him into my car carefully, drove him home to our house, and helped him walk inside. While we'd been gone, I'd paid a locksmith to change all the locks. New keys, new deadbolts, everything secure. I helped Declan settle into his room, and he immediately asked if Tessa or Jasper might try to come here. I promised him they wouldn't get past the front door, that I'd made absolutely sure of that. The next morning, the detective called again. She told me the district attorney was reviewing the case for possible criminal charges of reckless endangerment and filing a false police report. The false 911 call was particularly serious because it was a crime all by itself, separate from the negligence that came after. She explained the DA would make a decision within 2 weeks, and I should prepare to testify if charges were filed. I told her I was absolutely ready to do whatever was needed. Later that day, Fiona came over to help me set up a new routine for Declan's care. We programmed multiple trusted numbers into his medical alert system, tested all the equipment thoroughly, and created written protocols for different emergency scenarios. We made laminated cards with instructions for what to do if he had a seizure, who to call, what information to give the paramedics. The level of preparation required now, because I couldn't trust anyone the way I'd trusted Tessa, felt like another cost of her betrayal. Every backup system we created was a reminder that she'd destroyed my ability to rely on other people. That evening, Alicia called with an update. Jasper's parents had contacted her offering to pay all of Declan's medical bills if I dropped the civil suit. I actually laughed when she told me. They clearly didn't understand the situation at all. This wasn't about money. It was about consequences and accountability and making sure they understood the magnitude of what they'd done. I told Alicia to reject the offer immediately and proceed with the lawsuit exactly as planned. The follow-up appointment with Gideon happened 2 weeks after Declan came home. I drove him to the medical center and we sat in the waiting room while he picked at his fingernails, a nervous habit he'd developed since the seizure. The nurse called us back and took his vitals. Then Gideon came in with a tablet showing brain scan results. He pulled up a chair and explained the images, pointing to areas that showed abnormal activity patterns. The damage from the prolonged seizure was permanent. Declan would need stronger anti-seizure medications for the rest of his life, more frequent checkups every month instead of every 3 months, and he might experience cognitive effects like memory problems or difficulty concentrating. Gideon walked through the new medication schedule and the warning signs we needed to watch for. Declan's face went pale as he listened, and I reached over to squeeze his hand. I promised him we'd handle whatever came, that we'd adjust and manage everything together. But inside, I was adding this permanent damage to my mental list of things Tessa and Jasper would answer for. Every pill Declan would take for the rest of his life, every doctor visit, every cognitive struggle, all of it traced back to 40 minutes of their selfishness. Gideon gave us the new prescriptions and scheduled the next appointment before we left. 3 days later, I was leaving work at the end of my shift when I spotted Tessa standing near my car in the parking lot. My stomach dropped. She had no reason to be at my workplace. No legitimate business here at all. I kept walking toward my car and she stepped forward, hands up like she was approaching a wild animal. She started talking about needing just 5 minutes to explain, to make me understand what happened. I stopped about 10 feet away and told her she'd violated the no-contact order Alicia had sent. If she approached me again, I was calling the police for harassment. Her face crumpled and she started shouting that I was being unreasonable and cruel, that it was an accident, that she never meant for anyone to get hurt. I turned and walked to my car while she was still yelling, unlocked it, got in, and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I could see her standing there in the parking lot, arms wrapped around herself. I felt absolutely zero sympathy for her distress. She'd made her choices and now she got to live with the consequences of those choices. I called Alicia on my way home to report the violation, and she said she'd file documentation with the court. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was someone from the district attorney's office calling to schedule a meeting about the criminal case. I took a day off work and drove downtown to the DA's office the following week. The prosecutor handling the case was a sharp woman in her 40s with short hair and glasses, sitting behind a desk covered in case files. She shook my hand and got straight to business, explaining they were planning to charge both Tessa and Jasper with reckless endangerment and filing a false police report. The charges could mean jail time if they were convicted, possibly up to 2 years for the reckless endangerment and another year for the false report. She walked me through what the trial process would look like, the timeline we were looking at, and what my role as a witness would involve. Then she asked if I was prepared for the emotional toll of going through a trial, having to testify about what happened, seeing them in court. I looked her straight in the eye and told her I was prepared to do whatever it took to see this through. She nodded and made a note in her file, then said she'd be in touch as the case progressed. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Neil. He apologized for Tessa showing up at my work, said he'd told her to leave me alone but she wasn't listening to anyone right now. Then he added that she'd been fired from her job for missing too many days while dealing with her guilt. I sat on my couch reading that text and felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. Consequences were starting to pile up for her. She'd lost her best friend. Her relationship with Jasper had apparently fallen apart based on what Neil had mentioned before, and now her job was gone too. I texted Neil back thanking him for the information and for being decent about this whole situation, which was more than I could say for his sister. He responded immediately saying he understood and he was sorry for everything that had happened. Declan started having nightmares that same week. The first time, I woke up to him crying out in his room around 2 a.m. I ran in and found him sitting up in bed, sweating and breathing hard, his hands shaking as he reached for me. He'd been dreaming about the seizure, about being alone and no one coming to help. I sat on the edge of his bed and held his hand while he calmed down, reassuring him that he was safe, that I was here, that nothing like that would ever happen again. But I could see the psychological damage this had caused beyond just the physical effects. His trust had been broken in a fundamental way. He'd believed Tessa was calling for help, had believed she cared about him, and instead she'd been upstairs with Jasper while he was dying. The nightmares continued for weeks, sometimes multiple times in one night. I'd sit with him during each episode, promising him over and over that I wouldn't leave him, that he was safe now. The knowledge that Tessa's selfishness hadn't just risked his life, but had also traumatized him this deeply, made my determination to see her punished grow even stronger. 2 weeks after the DA meeting, Alicia called with news about the civil suit. Jasper's lawyer had contacted her with a settlement proposal. They'd pay $50,000 if I agreed to drop the suit and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Alicia explained it was actually a reasonable offer considering the costs and time involved in going to trial. The legal fees alone would eat up a chunk of any judgment, and there was always risk involved in letting a jury decide. But I rejected the offer immediately. This wasn't about getting their money and staying quiet. I wanted a public record of what they'd done. I wanted a judgment against them that would follow them for years, that would show up on background checks and credit reports. I wanted everyone who ever looked into their history to know exactly what kind of people they were. Alicia said she understood and would inform Jasper's lawyer that we were proceeding to trial as planned. The preliminary hearing for the criminal charges happened 2 months after the incident. I took another day off work and drove to the courthouse, going through security and finding the right courtroom. Tessa and Jasper sat at separate tables with their lawyers, not looking at each other. The prosecutor presented the charges formally, and the judge asked how they pleaded. Both said not guilty, which I'd expected. Their lawyers would try to minimize what happened, to make it sound like a mistake or an accident instead of criminal negligence. The judge set a trial date for 3 months out and went over the conditions of their release, including the no-contact orders. I sat in the gallery watching them stand before the judge and answer questions, watching them have to acknowledge the charges against them in open court. It was the first real sense of justice beginning to happen. They couldn't pretend anymore that this was just a private matter between friends. The legal system had recognized that what they did was criminal, and now they'd have to answer for it. 6 weeks after the first seizure, Declan had another one. I was in the kitchen making dinner when his medical monitor started beeping. I ran to his room and found him on his bed, body jerking, foam at his mouth. My hands were shaking as I called 911, trying not to panic, trying to stay calm and give them the information they needed. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes this time. They got the seizure stopped with medication, and it only lasted 8 minutes total before they had it under control. They took him to the hospital for observation, and Gideon met us there to run tests. He explained that the increased frequency was likely a direct result of the damage from the prolonged seizure. The 40 minutes of seizing had changed Declan's brain chemistry in ways that made future seizures more likely and harder to control. Every new complication felt like fresh evidence of what Tessa and Jasper's negligence had cost us. The medical bills kept piling up, the medications kept getting more expensive, and Declan's quality of life kept getting worse. All because 2 people couldn't stop having sex long enough to make a phone call. I started seeing a therapist the following week. Not because I wanted to forgive Tessa and Jasper, but because I needed to function while pursuing justice against them. The anger was eating at me in ways that were starting to affect my sleep and my work. The therapist was a woman in her 50s who specialized in trauma and betrayal. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, then helped me understand that my rage was justified and healthy, as long as I channeled it into something productive, rather than letting it consume me. She validated that some betrayals are unforgivable, that choosing not to forgive doesn't make me bitter or damaged. It makes me someone with appropriate boundaries who understands that actions have consequences. Not everyone deserves forgiveness, and that's okay. I could be angry and still move forward with my life. I could pursue justice and still take care of myself and Declan. The 2 things weren't mutually exclusive. 3 weeks later, Alicia called to tell me Tessa's lawyer had filed a motion to dismiss the criminal charges. I had to sit through a hearing where they argued that panic and poor judgment don't rise to the level of criminal negligence. Tessa's lawyer stood up and talked about how she was scared and confused, how she made a mistake in a moment of crisis, how she never intended for anyone to be hurt. He made it sound like she was the victim, like she'd suffered enough already. I sat in the gallery with my hands clenched in my lap, listening to him try to minimize what happened. Then the prosecutor stood up and walked the judge through the timeline. She showed the fake screenshot Tessa had sent me, the call logs proving she never dialed 911, the medical records documenting 40 minutes of seizing. She argued that deliberately creating a fake 911 call while someone is dying goes well beyond poor judgment into criminal territory. This wasn't panic or confusion. This was a conscious choice to lie and deceive while my brother was having a medical emergency. The judge listened to both sides, then denied the motion. He stated clearly that the evidence showed deliberate deception during a life-threatening emergency, and that absolutely constituted criminal negligence worthy of trial. Watching Tessa's face when the judge ruled against her was deeply satisfying. She'd thought she could get away with it, thought she could minimize and excuse her way out of consequences. But the legal system wasn't buying it. 2 weeks after that hearing, Fiona called me during lunch break at work. She sounded kind of shaken up, which was weird because Fiona never got rattled by anything. She told me she'd been at the coffee shop near her apartment that morning when Jasper walked in. He spotted her immediately and came right over to her table before she could leave. He started talking fast, saying he needed her to give me a message because I wouldn't take his calls. He claimed he'd changed, that he'd learned from everything that happened, that he was going to therapy and working on himself. He said he hoped someday I could forgive him for what he did. Fiona cut him off and told him to get away from her table. She said I wasn't interested in his redemption story, and he needed to accept that some things can't be fixed with apologies. She told me she actually raised her voice at him in the coffee shop, which made other people stare. But she didn't care. The look on his face when she shut him down made it clear he'd expected her to be sympathetic or at least neutral. I thanked Fiona for having my back like that. Some people think everyone deserves forgiveness eventually, that holding on to anger is unhealthy or whatever. But Fiona understood that what Jasper and Tessa did permanently disqualified them from that grace. You don't get to nearly kill someone's brother and then ask for forgiveness like you forgot their birthday or something. The civil trial happened 3 months before the criminal one was scheduled. Alicia explained that civil cases move faster because the burden of proof is lower. We just had to show it was more likely than not that their negligence caused harm. The criminal trial would require proof beyond reasonable doubt, which took longer to build. I took 2 days off work to testify. The courthouse was this old building downtown with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. Alicia met me outside the courtroom on the first day and walked me through what would happen. I'd testify first, then they'd call medical experts and present evidence. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. When my turn came, I walked to the witness stand and put my hand on the Bible. The oath felt heavy, important. I promised to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. Then I sat down and looked out at the courtroom. Tessa and Jasper were sitting at the defense table with their lawyers. Neither of them would look at me. The prosecutor was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight. She asked me to describe what happened that day, starting from when I got the first medical alert. I went through the whole timeline. The alert on my phone while I was shopping, calling Tessa and begging her to call for help. The fake screenshot she sent me. Arriving at the hospital and discovering no ambulance had been dispatched. Racing home and finding Declan still seizing after 40 minutes. Hearing the sounds from upstairs while my brother was dying on the couch. The prosecutor showed me the medical records from the hospital. She asked me to identify the timestamps, the oxygen levels, the heart rate readings. Every number was evidence of how long Declan had suffered. Then she asked about the costs. I listed everything. The 5-day hospital stay. The new medications that cost hundreds of dollars every month. The increased monitoring equipment. The therapy for Declan's anxiety and trauma. The lost wages from taking time off work. It all added up to over $60,000 so far, with ongoing costs that would continue indefinitely. Alicia took over after that and presented the medical records. The fake 911 screenshot Tessa had sent me and expert testimony. A neurologist explained what happens to the brain during a prolonged seizure. He used words like hypoxia and neuronal damage and cognitive impairment. He said 40 minutes of continuous seizing could cause permanent brain injury, increased seizure frequency, and memory problems. Everything he described matched what was happening to Declan. The defense lawyers tried to argue that Tessa had panicked and made a mistake, that she never intended for anyone to get hurt. They showed text messages where Tessa had apologized, like that somehow made up for nearly killing someone. But Alicia destroyed that argument by showing the timeline of when those texts were sent. Tessa hadn't texted me until after I'd already found out she lied. She only apologized once she got caught. The jury went to deliberate after 2 days of testimony. Alicia told me it could take hours or even days for them to reach a verdict, but they came back in less than 3 hours. That was a good sign, she said. Quick deliberations usually meant the evidence was clear. The foreman stood up and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Both defendants were liable for negligence, emotional distress, and medical costs. The jury awarded us $90,000 in damages plus all ongoing medical costs for Declan's care. I felt something release in my chest when I heard those words. This wasn't about the money. It was about a jury of regular people looking at what happened and saying, yes, this was wrong. These people need to pay for what they did. Tessa's parents called me the next day. I saw the number pop up on my phone and sent it straight to voicemail. They called again an hour later. Again to voicemail. Then they tried emailing me. The subject line said, "Please, we need to talk about our daughter." I deleted it without reading past that. They called Alicia's office that afternoon. Her secretary told them Alicia wasn't available, but they insisted it was urgent. They finally got through to her and asked if there was any way to work something out about the criminal trial. They wanted to know if I'd consider asking the prosecutor to reduce the charges or accept a plea deal. Maybe Tessa could do community service instead of jail time. Maybe she could pay a fine. They were willing to pay more money if that would help. Alicia called me right after she got off the phone with them. She said they sounded desperate, like they were trying anything to protect their daughter from real consequences. I told Alicia to make it absolutely clear that I had zero interest in plea deals or reduced charges. I wanted Tessa and Jasper to face the full weight of what they'd done. The criminal trial would proceed exactly as planned, and I would testify again if needed. Their daughter nearly killed my brother because she couldn't stop having sex long enough to make a phone call. No amount of money or begging from her parents would change that. Alicia said she'd handle all future communication with them, and would tell them not to contact me directly again. After she hung up, I sat there thinking about how their desperation to shield Tessa from accountability just proved I was doing the right thing. They wanted to protect her from consequences, but consequences were exactly what she needed to face. The criminal trial started 4 months after the incident. By then it was deep into fall and the weather had turned cold. I took a whole week off work this time because Alicia said the trial would take at least 3 or 4 days. The courtroom was packed on the first day. I recognized some people from the civil trial, plus reporters who were covering the case now that criminal charges were involved. The prosecutor was a different woman this time. Younger but just as sharp. She laid out the charges in her opening statement. Reckless endangerment and filing a false police report. She told the jury they would hear testimony about a 40-minute seizure that could have been stopped in minutes if someone had just called for help. She said they would see evidence of a fake 911 call created to deceive someone while their brother was dying. She promised to prove beyond reasonable doubt that both defendants knowingly and deliberately chose not to help, and that choice nearly cost a life. I testified again on day 2. This time the questions were more detailed, more focused on what I knew and when I knew it. The prosecutor walked me through every phone call, every text message, every moment of that nightmare. She asked me to describe finding Declan on the couch, his body jerking, foam coming from his mouth. She asked me what I heard from upstairs while I was trying to help him. I told the truth about the moaning, the bed creaking, the sounds of two people who couldn't stop what they were doing even for a medical emergency. Several jurors looked disgusted. Tessa's lawyer tried to make me seem unreliable on cross-examination. He asked if I was sure about the timeline, if maybe I'd gotten confused in the panic. But I had the medical app records showing every alert, every vital sign, every minute that passed. The evidence backed up everything I said. Then the medical experts testified. The same neurologist from the civil trial explained the brain damage again. He brought scans of Declan's brain, showed the jury exactly where the damage occurred. He said the first 10 minutes of a seizure are critical. After that, every additional minute increases the risk of permanent harm. 40 minutes was catastrophic. Another expert testified about seizure protocols and emergency response. She said the standard response time for a medical emergency like this should be under 5 minutes from call to arrival. If Tessa had called 911 when I first asked her to, paramedics would have reached Declan within minutes. The seizure would have been stopped before serious damage occurred. But because of the 40-minute delay, Declan now had permanent brain injury, increased seizure frequency, and cognitive impairments that would affect him for the rest of his life. On day 3, Tessa took the stand. She wore a conservative dress and had her hair pulled back. Her lawyer had obviously coached her on how to look sympathetic. She cried while she testified, talking about how scared she was, how she didn't know what to do, how she never meant for anyone to get hurt. She claimed she'd panicked and frozen, that she'd meant to call 911 but got confused and sent me a fake screenshot instead. It made no sense, and the prosecutor tore it apart. How do you accidentally create a fake screenshot? How do you panic for 40 straight minutes? Why were you upstairs with someone if you were so worried about Declan? Tessa couldn't answer any of it without contradicting herself. Her tears didn't move me at all. I sat in the gallery watching her cry, and all I could see was her laughing as she came down those stairs in her robe. All I could remember was my brother dying on the couch while she was upstairs with my boyfriend. Her tears were for herself, for the consequences she was finally facing. They weren't for Declan or what she'd done to him. Jasper testified on day 4 and immediately tried to throw Tessa under the bus. His strategy was clear from the first question. He claimed Tessa had told him she'd called 911 and the ambulance was on the way. He said he'd believed her, that he had no idea she was lying. He painted himself as another victim of her deception. Tessa's lawyer jumped up and objected, saying Jasper was trying to shift blame. The judge sustained the objection and told the jury to disregard Jasper's characterization, but the damage was done. The jury had seen him try to save himself by sacrificing Tessa. They'd seen that these two people who'd been so wrapped up in each other that they couldn't call for help were now willing to destroy each other to avoid consequences. During cross-examination, the prosecutor asked Jasper why he didn't check on Declan himself if he was so concerned. Why didn't he call 911 directly instead of trusting Tessa? Why didn't he come downstairs when he heard me arrive and start calling for real help? Jasper stammered through his answers, contradicting himself multiple times. He finally admitted he'd been distracted and not thinking clearly. The prosecutor asked him to clarify what had distracted him for 40 minutes while someone was dying downstairs. He couldn't answer without admitting what everyone already knew. Their relationship, the thing that had cost my brother so much, was falling apart right there in court. They were turning on each other, each trying to minimize their own guilt by maximizing the other's. It would have been satisfying if it wasn't so pathetic. These were the people I'd trusted. This was the man I'd dated for 2 years, and the woman who'd been my best friend since high school. And when faced with real consequences, they couldn't even stand together. They crumbled and blamed each other like children. The jury got the case on day 5 after closing arguments. The prosecutor summarized all the evidence, the timeline, the medical testimony, the fake 911 call. She reminded them that reckless endangerment means knowingly doing something that puts another person at serious risk. Filing a false police report means deliberately creating fake documentation to deceive authorities. Both defendants had done exactly those things. The defense lawyers argued their clients had made mistakes but not crimes, that panic and poor judgment weren't the same as criminal intent. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. Alicia and I waited in a conference room down the hall, drinking bad coffee and not talking much. When the bailiff finally called us back, my hands were shaking. The jury filed in and none of them looked at the defense table. Alicia squeezed my hand and whispered that was a good sign. The foreman stood up. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. Yes, they had. Guilty on both counts for both defendants. Tessa started crying immediately. Jasper just stared straight ahead, his face blank. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks out. I walked out of that courtroom feeling lighter than I had in months. The weight I'd been carrying since that terrible night, the burden of knowing what they'd done and wondering if they'd ever really answer for it, finally lifted. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge would have been doing something to hurt them the way they hurt us. This was about accountability. This was about making sure they understood that actions have consequences, that you can't nearly kill someone and walk away without answering for it. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was enough. 2 weeks later, we all gathered in the same courtroom for sentencing. The judge asked if anyone wanted to make a statement before he imposed sentence. I stood up. I'd written something the night before, but when I got to the podium, I put the paper in my pocket. I looked at Tessa and Jasper sitting at the defense table and spoke from the heart instead. I told the judge about my brother, about his medical condition, and how he depended on people to help him during emergencies. I described finding him on that couch, knowing he'd been suffering for 40 minutes because two people were too selfish to make a phone call. I explained how his life had changed since then. The permanent damage, the increased seizures, the memory problems. I said I wasn't asking for maximum punishment or trying to destroy their lives. I just wanted them to face appropriate consequences for what they'd done. When I finished, the judge nodded and asked the defendants if they wanted to speak. Tessa stood up and apologized through tears. Jasper said he took responsibility for his actions. The judge listened to both of them, then delivered his sentence. For Tessa, 18 months in jail and 3 years probation. For Jasper, 12 months in jail and 2 years probation. Both were ordered to pay full restitution for all of Declan's medical costs, past and future. Both were prohibited from having any contact with me or Declan for 5 years. The bailiffs came forward and put handcuffs on both of them. I watched them being led away. Tessa still crying. Jasper walking with his head down. I felt something close to peace settle over me. Not happiness exactly, but a sense that justice had been served appropriately. They would spend time in jail thinking about what they'd done. They would pay for Declan's care, and we would never have to see them again. The months after sentencing were about rebuilding and healing. Declan's condition stabilized somewhat, though he would never be back to where he was before. His seizures were more frequent now, happening every few weeks instead of every few months. The new medications helped control them better, but they made him tired and affected his coordination. He had memory issues that frustrated him, forgetting conversations we'd had or appointments he'd made. Sometimes he'd ask me the same question 3 times in one day, but he was alive. He was healing as much as his damaged brain would allow, and he knew that the people who hurt him had faced real consequences. That mattered to him more than I'd expected. One night, about 4 months after the sentencing, he told me he'd been worried that Tessa and Jasper would get away with it. He said seeing them actually go to jail helped him believe that the world wasn't completely unfair, that people couldn't just hurt others without answering for their actions. I hugged him and promised I would always fight for him, always make sure he was protected and safe. The medical bills kept coming, but the restitution payments started arriving too. Small amounts deducted from Tessa and Jasper's prison wages, plus larger payments that would come from their wages after release. It would take years to fully pay off what they owed, but every payment was a reminder that consequences were ongoing, that their actions would cost them for years, just like Declan would be dealing with the effects for years. Neil called me about 6 months after the sentencing. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. He said he wasn't calling to ask for anything or defend his sister. He just wanted to give me an update. Tessa was serving her sentence at a women's facility about 2 hours away. He'd visited her a few times and said she seemed different now, quieter and more serious. She'd started therapy in prison and was apparently working through what she'd done. Neil said she finally seemed to understand the gravity of her actions, that she'd nearly killed someone because she was too selfish to make a phone call. He wasn't asking me to forgive her or have any contact with her. He just wanted me to know she was facing reality now instead of making excuses. I thanked him for the update and told him honestly that I had no interest in Tessa's rehabilitation or redemption. That was between her and whatever conscience she might develop. What mattered to me was that she'd faced consequences and would continue facing them for years. If she grew from that experience, fine. If she didn't, that wasn't my problem. Neil said he understood and respected that. He told me he was sorry for what his sister did and hoped Declan was doing okay. Then he hung up. I stood there holding the phone for a minute, thinking about how some people can surprise you. Neil had no obligation to keep me updated or apologize for his sister. But he did it anyway, because he understood that accountability mattered. Fiona came over for dinner one night about 7 months after everything ended. We'd gotten closer through the whole ordeal, and she'd become one of my most trusted friends. Over pizza and beer, she told me she was impressed by how I'd handled everything. She said a lot of people would have wanted revenge, would have tried to hurt Tessa and Jasper the way they'd hurt us. But I'd chosen the harder path of legal accountability instead, pursuing justice through the system rather than taking matters into my own hands. I told her honestly that there were moments I'd wanted revenge. Moments when I fantasized about making them suffer the way Declan had suffered. But I'd chosen differently because I wanted to be able to look at myself in the mirror, wanted to maintain my integrity even while pursuing consequences. Legal accountability felt right in a way that revenge never would have. It meant other people, objective people like judges and juries, had looked at what happened and agreed it was wrong. It meant there was a public record of their actions and the consequences they faced. It meant I hadn't become the kind of person who hurts others, even when I had every reason to want to. Fiona raised her beer and toasted to justice and integrity. We clinked bottles and drank, and I felt grateful for friends like her who understood that doing the right thing isn't always easy or satisfying, but it's still worth doing. 2 months after the trial ended, I put the house on the market. Walking through those rooms felt wrong now, like the walls still held the memory of Declan seizing on the couch while Tessa and Jasper were upstairs. Every corner reminded me of that night. The real estate agent said the market was good and we'd probably sell fast, which turned out to be true. 3 weeks later, a young couple made an offer and we accepted. I spent the next month packing up our entire lives, sorting through what to keep and what to throw away. Declan helped when he felt up to it, but mostly he stayed in his room avoiding the memories too. The day we moved out, I didn't look back at the house. I just locked the door for the last time and drove away. Our new place was smaller, a 2-bedroom apartment across town in a quiet neighborhood. No history here, no bad memories soaked into the carpet. Declan picked the bedroom with better light, and I helped him set up his medical equipment in the corner. The first night in the new place, he slept through without waking up scared. That alone made the move worth it. We spent the next few weeks making the apartment feel like home, hanging pictures and arranging furniture until it stopped feeling temporary. Dr. Garza scheduled a follow-up appointment 6 weeks after we moved. I drove Declan to the medical center, and we sat in the waiting room flipping through old magazines until they called us back. Garza reviewed all of Declan's recent test results on his computer screen, clicking through charts and scans while we waited. He turned to face us and explained that Declan's condition was as stable as it was going to get. The seizures were managed with the current medication, happening about once every 6 weeks instead of the daily episodes he'd had right after the 40-minute seizure. The cognitive issues had plateaued, meaning they weren't getting worse, but they also weren't going away. Declan would always have some memory problems and slower processing speed compared to before. Garza said this was survival and stability, which mattered more than perfect recovery. He adjusted one of the medications slightly and scheduled another appointment for 3 months out. In the car afterward, Declan asked me if I was disappointed that he wasn't back to normal. I told him I was grateful he was alive, and that we'd made it through the worst. He nodded and looked out the window. I meant what I said, but part of me would always be angry about what was taken from us by two people who couldn't stop screwing each other long enough to make a phone call. The first restitution payment arrived in my bank account on a Tuesday morning 2 months after sentencing. I checked my phone and saw the deposit notification. $73 from Tessa Moss. Another notification came through right after. $56 from Jasper Lane. These tiny amounts were being garnished from whatever jobs they'd managed to get, probably minimum wage positions since their criminal records made better employment hard to find. I did the math in my head. At this rate, it would take them over 10 years to pay off the full judgment. Every month for the next decade, these small deposits would show up as a reminder that consequences were ongoing. Their actions kept costing them, just like Declan kept dealing with seizures and memory problems. I showed Declan the bank notifications, and he stared at the numbers for a long time. He said it felt weird that money could somehow make up for what happened, but I explained it wasn't about the money making things right. It was about them paying a price that lasted, about accountability that didn't end when they walked out of jail. He understood that. We both understood that some debts take years to pay off. I started volunteering with a medical advocacy group called Safe Response Network 3 months after we moved. They helped families create emergency plans and navigate medical crises. I attended a training session where they taught us about backup systems, emergency protocols, and how to identify reliable caregivers. Everything I'd learned the hard way, they were teaching to others so they wouldn't have to learn it through trauma. My first assignment was helping a mom whose son had epilepsy set up a monitoring system with multiple emergency contacts. I walked her through testing every number, creating written protocols for different scenarios, and making sure no single person was responsible for life or death decisions. She thanked me about 5 times and said she felt so much safer knowing she had backup plans. Driving home that day, I felt like the nightmare had turned into something useful. I couldn't undo what happened to us, but I could help other families avoid it. Declan said he was proud of me when I told him about the volunteer work. That meant everything. His opinion mattered more than anyone else's because he was the one who'd almost died. A journalist from some medical safety website contacted me 4 months after the trial. She sent an email explaining she was writing a story about medical negligence and betrayal, and she'd found the public court records from our case. She wanted to interview me about what happened and how the legal system responded. I read her email twice and then deleted it. Our story wasn't entertainment for strangers clicking through articles over their morning coffee. What happened to us was private, painful, and already part of the public record through the trial documents. Anyone who wanted to know the facts could read the court transcripts. I didn't need to relive the worst night of my life for an audience of people who'd forget about it by the next day. Some experiences were meant to be processed privately, not performed publicly for clicks and shares. The journalist sent 2 follow-up emails, and I deleted those 2 without responding. Eventually, she stopped trying. I mentioned it to Alicia during a check-in call, and she said I'd made the right choice. The public record was enough. We didn't owe anyone our trauma as a story. Declan enrolled in community college 6 months after the trial ended. He'd spent weeks researching programs that could work with his cognitive limitations, and he'd found one with a good support system for students with medical conditions. He picked computer science because he'd always been interested in technology, and the coursework was flexible enough to work around his seizures and doctor appointments. I drove him to campus on his first day, and walked him to the Disability Services office where they set up his accommodations. Reduced course load, extra time on tests, permission to record lectures. They treated him like a real student who deserved to be there, not like someone who was broken. He came home after his first class looking tired but happy. Over the next few months, I watched him work on assignments at the kitchen table, sometimes struggling with concepts that would have been easy for him before, but pushing through anyway. He wasn't the same person he'd been before the seizure, but he was building a life that worked for who he was now, and that took more strength than most people ever had to show. I was proud of him every single day. Neil called me about 10 months after the trial to tell me Tessa was released early. She'd served 12 months of her 18-month sentence because of good behavior in prison. He said she was moving to another state to start over, somewhere nobody knew what she'd done. I listened to him talk and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just blank indifference. She'd served her time, she was paying restitution, and now she was leaving. That was exactly what I wanted. Her gone from our lives permanently. No possibility of running into her at the grocery store or seeing her at some mutual friend's party. Neil asked if I had any message for her, and I said no. He thanked me for taking his call and hung up. I sat there holding my phone for a minute, thinking about how Tessa was free now while Declan would never be free from the effects of that 40-minute seizure. But at least she'd faced consequences. At least there was a public record of what she'd done, and a criminal conviction that would follow her wherever she moved. That had to be enough because it was all the justice the system could provide. I heard through Fiona about 8 months later that Jasper had completed his sentence and probation. He was working some low-level job at a warehouse, barely making enough to cover rent and the monthly restitution payments. Fiona had run into someone who knew him, and they'd mentioned he was struggling. She told me this while we were having coffee and watched my face to see how I'd react. I felt no guilt about his struggles. He'd made a choice to ignore my dying brother so he could have sex with my best friend. These were simply the natural consequences of that choice playing out over time. His financial problems, his criminal record, his difficulty finding decent work. All of it traced back to decisions he'd made that night. I told Fiona I didn't feel bad for him at all, and she nodded like she'd expected that answer. Some people thought everyone deserved sympathy and second chances, but I wasn't one of those people anymore. Jasper had shown me exactly who he was, and I believed him. 2 years after that terrible night, Declan and I had built something stable. We had our apartment with no bad memories. We had routines that worked around his medical needs. We had Fiona and a few other friends we could actually trust. We'd both been through therapy, working on the trauma separately and together. I'd learned how to manage my anger so it didn't eat me alive. Declan had learned how to accept his limitations without giving up on goals. We had strong boundaries now. Nobody came into our lives without proving themselves first. Nobody got trusted with Declan's care without extensive vetting. We'd learned the hard way that some people would let you down in the worst possible moment, and we'd built our lives to account for that reality. The anger had faded into something quieter over time. Not forgiveness, never forgiveness, but acceptance that we'd survived and found justice. We were okay now. Not perfect, not the same as before, but genuinely okay with the life we'd built from the wreckage. Dr. Garza confirmed it at a routine checkup 2 years and 3 months after the incident. He reviewed Declan's latest tests and said his condition was as stable as it would get. The seizures were managed, happening every 6 to 8 weeks with medication controlling them quickly. The cognitive issues had stopped progressing, and Declan had learned to work around them. He'd always need monitoring and medication, but the prognosis was good for a long, full life with proper management. Garza said Declan had adapted remarkably well considering how close he'd come to dying that night. I sat there listening to him explain the long-term outlook, and felt tears building up that I'd been holding back for 2 years. My brother was going to be okay. Not cured, not back to who he was before, but okay. We'd made it through the worst and come out the other side alive. That was more than we'd had during those 40 minutes when I was racing home not knowing if he'd still be breathing when I got there. Garza handed me a tissue and I wiped my eyes, embarrassed to be crying in his office. But these were relief tears, the kind that came when you finally believed the nightmare was really over. A few months later, my boss called me into her office and told me I was getting promoted to senior coordinator with a significant raise. She said my dedication through everything that happened showed the kind of reliability they valued, and the team had voted unanimously to support my advancement. I walked out of that meeting feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, like my life was moving forward instead of just surviving. Fiona caught me in the break room afterward and hugged me, saying I was the most resilient person she knew. I shook my head and told her it wasn't resilience. Not really. It was just refusing to let other people's betrayal destroy the life I was building. There was a difference between bouncing back and simply deciding you won't be broken, and I'd chosen the second one. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. 3 years after that terrible night, I sat in the audience at the community college graduation ceremony, watching my brother walk across the stage to accept his associate's degree in computer science. He moved carefully, still aware of his limits, but his face showed pure pride in what he'd accomplished. I cheered so loud when they called his name that people around me smiled, and I didn't care if I looked silly, because Declan had worked twice as hard as other students to get here. The cognitive challenges made everything harder for him. Reading took longer. Remembering information required extra effort, but this achievement was entirely his own. After the ceremony, we went out for dinner and he told me something that stuck with me. He said he was grateful I fought for consequences against Tessa and Jasper because it helped him believe that justice exists, and people can't just hurt others without answering for it. That belief mattered to him, helped him trust the world again even just a little bit. I squeezed his hand across the table and told him he deserved justice, deserved to see them face real accountability for what they did. On the 4th anniversary of the incident, Declan and I had a quiet dinner at home. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad at our kitchen table. We talked about how far we'd come from that terrible night when I found him seizing on the couch, while 2 people who should have protected him were upstairs together. We discussed the life we'd built, the apartment with no bad memories, the routines that kept him safe, the friends we could actually trust like Fiona. We acknowledged the justice we'd achieved through the legal system, watching Tessa and Jasper face criminal charges and civil liability for their choices. Neither of us had forgiven them, and we didn't plan to. Some betrayals are permanent, and that's okay. We'd healed in the ways that matter without requiring forgiveness to move forward, without pretending what they did was something we could just get over. I looked at my brother now, healthy and educated and building his own life, and felt deep gratitude that I got home in time that day. The 40 minutes didn't cost us everything, though they cost us plenty. We lost things we can't get back. Declan's perfect health, my ability to trust easily, the innocence of believing people will do the right thing in emergencies. But we gained clarity about who deserves our trust, and what real accountability looks like. Our lives are good now, built on stronger foundations than before, with better boundaries and more careful choices about who we let close. We're both genuinely happy with the future we're creating together, and that happiness feels earned, not given, which makes it mean something real.